Buen Camino, pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps podcast. On this show, we're walking virtually alongside pilgrims and authors, connecting a community of pilgrims from across the world. I'm your host, Kevin Donahue, backpacker, pilgrim, and author of Sacred Steps, a pilgrimage journal. On this episode, we're talking to author and backpacker Andy Bull. His new book, Pilgrim Pathways, details 20 short walks across the English countryside to sacred sites, shrines, and cathedrals in Scotland, England, and Wales. Stay tuned after our interview for details on our upcoming episode, and subscribe to the podcast so that our episodes download automatically to your phone or device. And now, on with the show. Let's welcome Andy Bull to the Sacred Steps podcast. Andy Bull, welcome to the Sacred Steps podcast.
Hi, Kevin. Great to be here.
Lovely to have you, Andy. I'm so excited about your new book, Pilgrims Pathways, and I'm glad that we can talk about it. I'm glad that we could talk about it on the show today because this is an area, English pilgrimage, where I have a great interest, and there's a lot of story to tell. So I think if you don't mind, maybe give our audience just a quick overview of the book and these weekend escapes that you've outlined.
Sure. Well, so there's a couple of things to be said, I suppose, about pilgrimage in the British Isles. And one is that there's a historic context, which is that we had a guy called Henry VIII, you might have heard of, and having previously been defender of the faith and a great friend of the Pope, he fell out with the Pope over marital issues. And essentially, the Reformation came, and Henry and his men and Cromwell went around the country destroying everything they could of what they considered by then religious idolatry. All the pilgrim points, all the shrines, all the places which for centuries and centuries English, Welsh, Scottish people had been going to. And it was a very important part of everyday life. Everyone hoped to go on a pilgrimage of some kind, as today every Muslim will hope to go to Mecca. He wiped it out. From the 1530s, it was illegal. It was illegal to be a Catholic. It was legal to revere the saints. A whole tradition, a whole way of life, a whole important spiritual aspect of the lives of the people of this country were destroyed. And it wasn't really until the 19th century when a couple of things happened. You had it was no longer illegal to be a Catholic, which was kind of handy because I happen to be a Catholic, so that was good. And it was also that all sorts of people, I suppose of all faiths and none, started to think about pilgrimage and to rediscover it. The shrines started to get uncovered. All the remnants were found. Shrines were rebuilt. Pilgrimage started again. So that's like the historic aspect. The other thing is, I have been interested in pilgrimage for quite a long time, but I found a real problem, which is that, like a lot of people, I have quite a busy life, lots of commitments. It'd be very hard for me to get away to do a full-length pilgrimage, and lots of pilgrimages are pretty long. You know, the Via Francigena from London down to Rome, pretty long. It's got to be over 1,000 miles. The Compostela route, not sure quite how long that is, but it's long. There are many old pilgrimage routes in England which are also there and have been rediscovered, but again, they're very long. So what I felt I needed was a pilgrimage I could do in a weekend. So I started to look at the sites that there were, at the routes that there were, and to see what I could do to create a kind of edited highlights, which would still count as a pilgrimage. They'll still be pretty tough. You're still walking 20, 30 miles. It's still, strenuous, vigorous, and that they go to the most amazing places, either to some kind of fantastic conclusions, so a saint shrine, often within a cathedral, other times a much more obscure place. And that along the way, there would be old pilgrim shrines, holy crosses, holy wells, other places of reverence, or which date back to before the Reformation, that people could rediscover. And when I started looking, I pretty quickly found 20 of them. Was able to interest a publisher in it, and we did it. It was originally going to be weekend pilgrimages, but the kind of COVID situation has meant that we understand a lot of people are very nervous about being away from home too long, staying away from home too long. So I've also adapted them so that they can also be done as day walks. And very often you can get in on public transport, get in on a train, do the walk, train home. So I've hoped that I've tried to make it as relevant and appropriate and easy to follow in the current pandemic situations as you can.
Brilliant. And we're talking with Andy Bull. His new book is Pilgrim Pathways from Trailblazer Guides. I will put the links to Andy's new book in the show notes. Andy, I am so excited because, as you said, there are a lot of paths through the UK, and your book outlines through England, Scotland, Wales. So if you're interested in taking some of these trips, journeying to the UK, or if you live on the British Isles, these are great weekend and, as Andy said, even same-day opportunities. Take a look at the guidebook because he's mapped out the GPS tracks. You can simply download them to your device and follow along. But these are just experiences to take in. And I'm so fascinated with the ones you chose because, as you said, you found a lot of routes, and there are a number of shrines, monasteries, abbeys, and temples and cathedrals that you could have chosen. So I'm wondering if you could maybe highlight one or two of your pilgrim paths that stand out that our audience may want to focus on, either for their accessibility, their historical nature, or the spirituality of these walks.
Absolutely, Kevin. So stop me if I go on too long, but I'll run through a couple and see how you feel.
That's normally my problem, Andy. You stop me if we go on too long.
Yeah. So there's one that I'd like to mention particularly, and it's in West Sussex. It goes from a town called Haslemere to another town called Chichester, and it goes through amazing countryside, downland, the South Downs. And there are two interesting aspects of this pilgrimage. One is there is a connection with William Blake. Now, particularly for UK readers, Blake's very resonant character. He wrote a poem called which ran and did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountain green. And it goes back to a myth, a legend that there has been for centuries and centuries, that Jesus, as a young man, may have come to this country, crazy though it sounds, with his tin dealer uncle, Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph, we know, was a tin dealer. The west area of England was a big tin area. And we believe, and there are various other legends that I'll come to in one of the other walks about that. Now, Blake was, when he walking in the area that our pilgrimage goes through, started thinking about that. Looking at a particular hill, he started thinking about, could that myth be true? And then the poem got put to music by a guy called Hubert Parry, and it became a hymn called Jerusalem. There's another line from Blake, and was Jerusalem builded here in England's green and pleasant land? And that's very resonant for a UK audience. So that's one aspect of this pilgrimage. The other is a guy called Saint Richard, and his shrine is at Chichester at the end of the walk. He was the monk and the abbot at Chichester, was martyred for his beliefs. There's a very, I think pretty well-known prayer that he had that some listeners, viewers may remember. And it's got 3 lines in it, which are, again, very resonant. They go, "May I know thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly." And the thing about this route is you get on the old pilgrimage route to St. Richard's Shrine. This was before the Reformation, before Henry VIII's time. This was the 3rd most popular pilgrimage in England. Almost forgotten now. Richard, apart from people knowing the lines of that prayer, is almost completely forgotten. Blake is known about, but Blake got the idea and did those feet from a hill called the Trundle, which overlooks from the top of the Trundle Hill. You can see Chichester. And then along the way, we stop at pilgrim churches, very ancient Saxon pilgrim churches, other places, sites of reverence, some of them pre-Christian, because what you do find with these things is that before they were Christian sites, they were pagan sites, Celtic pagan sites, Druid sites. And what happened quite a lot was when Christianity came, if there was a point at which a particular god, pagan god, was being praised, being prayed to, you plonked a church on top of it. So it was a kind of acquiring the places, the significant places to people, and significant in their lives of faith and belief. So
yeah,
that's
I think
one.
there's a lot of stories about of different places where the purpose of the sites have evolved through different faiths. And you've outlined that in the book, and one that I think our audience, especially in Europe, and those from the States who may be considering traveling to the UK, may be very interested in reconnecting with, is what you have identified correctly as the English Camino. Can you talk a little bit about that route?
Absolutely. This is very interesting. So this route, this is in County Durham, in the north of England, and it goes from a very small village called Escomb up through Durham, wonderful city, my favorite city in the country, and on to a place called Finchale Priory. And the point about that, and why it's called the English Camino, is that if you go back to the 12th century, there was a guy called Godric, who was a sailor. He, on his voyages all around the Mediterranean and further afield, he also combined them with pilgrimages. We know he went to Rome, and we believe he went at least twice to Santiago. And when he came back to the UK, when he'd finished his days at sea, he was given a hermitage on the river north of Durham. And a tradition developed that if you did the English Camino, this route that I've mentioned, going from Finchale down to Escomb, if you did that route and then you went as an English pilgrim to Compostela, you got 25 kilometers off the total that you needed. So it was like doing your first step. And very recently, and about 4 years ago, a group developed called I think they're called the Finchale community. They decided to restore this, and they have done. And sure enough, if you're an English pilgrim and you do the English Camino, you still get your 25 kilometers off towards your route when you finally get to Spain.
Well, and that's an important note for those who are considering pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, because in order to obtain the Compostela, you need to complete at least 100 kilometers. So here's an opportunity within England to go ahead and complete 25 of those, and is recognized by the cathedral in Santiago for its spiritual nature and for the connection it has to Santiago. So even if you're not doing the Camino de Santiago, this English portion is a really great way to celebrate the faith of the Camino. And then I was touched by and really interested in the St. Andrew's Way, which you said along the coastline from Fife, because there are some caves and such that are holy caves from the hermits.
Yeah. Well, the big draw here is St. Andrew, so the patron saint of Scotland, and there is a city called St. Andrews, and the story there is that, I mean, this is a myth, but it's a wonderful myth, which is that St. Rule came in the year 347, so quite a long time ago, with relics of St. Andrew, and he was shipwrecked and landed on the coast at where St. Andrews is now, and established a church, and then later a cathedral, and that became the key pilgrimage place in Scotland. It was massively important, but to get there, it was it's remote. As you mentioned, it's along the Fife coast. Now, the Fife coast is incredibly rocky coast. You go up north of Edinburgh, rocky coast. I mean, it's a tough pilgrim route. I have a lot of warnings about don't go when it's high tide, because you will not get through certain bits of it. So that aside, in about the 11th, 12th century, the Earl of Fife decided to try and help pilgrims. So he established a ferry which would take them, when they're coming from the south, from Edinburgh and so on, take them across the Firth Firth of Forth, 7 miles from North Berwick, and they would land at a place which became known as Earlsferry. And my pilgrimage starts at Earlsferry. He was bringing over, by the way, 10, 15,000 pilgrims every year. And we're talking 500-600 years ago. This was a long time ago. So anyway, so you get to Earlsferry, and then you go around the coast. And what you find is that you come to points where there are a whole string of kind of Celtic hermits who've since become saints. So one of the first places you get to is a place called St. Mohan's, and St. Mohan was again a hermit. He had a little hermitage just in a cave or a rocky promontory out on the coast. But there was a king, King David II of Scotland, was suffering from some terrible mortal wounds after a battle, and he couldn't heal them. And he went to this place, prayed to St. Mohan, and was cured. And after that, he built the church there. You go around. There's a couple. I'll just mention one other because I can go on about this. So then there's a wonderful little fishing village called Pittenweem. And there's a cave there to a saint called St. Filian. Now you get to Pittenweem. It's a lovely fishing village. You can picture little windy streets. There's this huge, great lump of rock. It looks like a massive piece of popcorn with a little door in it, and that was St. Filian's cave. And there you can go there, but it's locked up. But you go to the coffee shop in the village, ask to borrow the key, hopefully buy a coffee while you're there, go in, and it's just this amazing place. And there are others. I could tell you there's about another 3 or 4 incredible ancient places along the way. Again, probably pre-Christian in their origins.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Andy Bull. His new book, Pilgrims Pathways, we're detailing some of the routes across England, Scotland, and Wales. It's a great guide to a single day or short Camino experience through the traditional English pilgrim pathways. 2 to 3 day trips. So if you're coming into the UK, this is a great way to add a day or two of adventure to your experience while you're in the British Isles. Andy's written several other books. We'll link them in the show notes, and please check those out. But columnist and author Andy Bull joins us on the Sacred Steps podcast outlining his new book. Andy, I want to talk to you about some artifacts because this is so fascinating to me. It just speaks so much to the English tradition of pilgrimage. And I wonder if you could talk about any of the type of tokens and trinkets that people may have taken home with them from any of these pilgrimages.
Yeah, well, so like you have the shell that you got from the Compostela, you had different badges for different pilgrimages, and there was actually quite a practical reason for this because they're very often going to the shrine of a saint, and what people started doing was chipping bits off them, and that wasn't good because if you're getting 15,000 people a year and they all chip a little bit off, there's not going to be a lot left of the shrine. I'm going to hold one up to the camera now if you can see this. So this is one that I bought in Westminster Abbey. So Westminster Abbey is our finest church. It's the finest English church. The shrine there is to St. Edward the Confessor, who was the second to last Saxon king. This is going back before we had the last time we were invaded in 1066 when the Normans came over and started rebuilding all our churches. So, okay, we've got long memory. We don't forget these things, and we don't want it to happen again.
We haven't forgotten that happened. Yes.
Yeah. I know you've got some issues with us as well on that, but we'll draw a veil over that. So that's one that you can buy in the shop there, and it's still a great thing to do. You also now get pilgrim passports quite often. Not as many as I'd like to see. I'd love to see more of those coming. Yeah. And I could mention something about the shrines themselves. I don't know if you're interested in that, Kevin.
Well, before you go into that, I do want to mention to everyone who's listening, 2020 was to be the year of the English cathedrals. And so there is a pilgrim's passport that has been published by the Anglican Church. And so you can reach out and get this passport in any of the cathedrals. And as you're visiting them, whether you're making a backpacking type pilgrimage or whatever it may be, the cathedrals and the shops are happy to stamp them for you and mark your pilgrimage. And I'm sorry, Andy, I didn't mean to talk over you there. Please.
No, no, not at all. And it's also worth adding to that, Kevin, that many of the shrines which were destroyed in about over the last century have been restored. They've been revived. So pilgrimages come back, and it's not just, Catholics are more conscious of it, I think, but Anglicans, people of all faiths and none. The Orthodox Church in this country also. It's a tradition that a lot of us are choosing to reclaim. Whatever we believe, we're choosing to reclaim it.
Yeah, well, and great point, because there are a lot of faiths practiced throughout the UK, and I'm sort of this hybrid because I grew up in the Methodist Church, so we have that English Methodist tradition of Wesley as well.
Okay.
I've been excited about this book. I have poured through a lot of the pages. I'm planning, if everything goes well, to be in the UK and to begin pilgrimage in London, making my way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral.
Yeah.
And I know you're familiar with this route. So I want to talk a little bit about the English Pilgrims Way. For those of you who are listening and are interested in this route, I'll link it in the show notes. So please pop over, because we have an outline of some itineraries. And Andy, maybe talk about, I'm going from London, but this route also extends a bit more traditionally further.
Well, there is, and that's a new. I mean, first of all, the Pilgrim's Way, it's the most famous, probably because of Chaucer. Yeah. So, 14th century English author who decides to write a book in which he goes with a group of pilgrims and they tell stories as pilgrims did. And they start from Southwark, which is on the south bank of the Thames in the centre of London. And they started traditionally from an inn called the Tabard. Now, the Tabard's not there anymore, but a very, very similar inn called the George is. These are kind of galleried inns. If you can picture, you go into a courtyard, there's a building all around you, it's got balconies all around it, rooms above, little bars in. The George is a most fantastic pub, and that's the closest you can get to a kind of pilgrim experience there. But
Andy, I have to stop you, because what I hear you saying is, during my pilgrimage, it would be traditional for me to stop in at the pub and maybe have a pint before I go. Is that in keeping with the pilgrimage tradition? I need to do this because I can say Andy Bull sent me.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, Chaucer has a lot of fun about the people, why they're going, and and questioning their motives. And let's face it, a lot of them had suspect motives. They were hoping to buy time out of purgatory, and some of them wanted cures. They wanted something, and some of them were quite rich and they wanted to have a great time. But even the ordinary person, it would be a celebration. I mean, I was in Turkey once, and we were in a coach, and a massive great queue of cars was coming towards us on this remote road. Massive queue. And I said, what are they doing? They're going to crash into us. And he said, they're coming back from Mecca. They're very happy. And I suspect pilgrims went, they were very happy. They were doing an amazing thing, something they might only do once in their lifetime. So it should be a joyous event. And there's nothing more joyous for me than a pint of English beer in a nice pub and possibly a plate of fish and chips. So you definitely should do that.
I will definitely be doing that. I'm going to be going from London, so I'll be starting right there. And help me, Andy, because my American tongue gets in the way. We would expect to say Southwark Cathedral, but it is
Southwark
Cathedral.
Southwark.
I'll work on that one.
The
other I've got really well. I know I'm going to make it to Canterbury, but also there is a route of this pilgrimage that starts actually in Winchester, right?
In Rams. Oh, okay, yeah. So there is another branch of the traditional Pilgrims Way from Winchester, which is about halfway along England, along the south coast, just inland. So that was another branch for those who weren't coming, obviously via London. But a lot of people came to London and then went down. Some of the Winchester pilgrims wouldn't have got to London. They would have gone along a range of high hills to the south of London. Some would have gone by boat, but anyone who was coming either from London or from the north of England, as many of them would get to London, and then they would all group together and they would go down from Southwark.
Yeah, I'll be walking essentially that route along the Thames, making my way to a very traditional pilgrim cathedral in Rochester. where if you're interested in the Rochester Cathedral, many of the English cathedrals have a pilgrim's door. It's one that does have a pilgrim's door. And you feel such a great connection with the history because you can see the stones themselves have been worn as pilgrims for almost 1,000 years have made these pilgrim pathways and routes to these holy and sacred places. This route connects to the North Downs Way, and it takes us through Andy's boyhood home in Kent. So give us a bit of a perspective on this walk because you know it so very well.
Yeah, well, it's something that I've known. I mean, we went to live quite near Rochester. I mean, Rochester's a town in a kind of conurbation. Rochester's the nice bit. There's a lot of horrible towns, and I live in one of the horrible towns. But I was on the edge of town, the countryside. And as you say, the route goes from Rochester. It picks up the North Downs. So this is Chalk Downs. You're walking high. So it would have been a good route in bad weather, and we get a little bit of that here. Good in winter. And it's now a lane, actually. It's a tarmac lane called the Pilgrims Way, and it runs right along the downs. It goes through various villages. And I lived in a village quite close to it. So I was just familiar with it. My first knowledge of the idea of pilgrimages was seeing those road signs as I cycled on my bike around that area. But you will find as you go along that road, you'll find old pilgrim hostelries, which there would have been every few miles, inns. And we're hoping that after COVID, our inns will open again. We're a little worried in this country about a big part of our tradition that's under threat because of this, because they've been making no money for most of the year. But you will find these amazing places. You'll go through little villages. I think Chilham is on it. I'm not so familiar with that end, but there are lovely little villages going all the way down to Canterbury.
Absolutely. And for more details on the Pilgrims Way, we'll link it in the show notes below. But what you mentioned, one of the little pubs and inns, as you come from Rochester and you make your way down to the North Downs Way and connect from the river and coming through, you pass the Robin Hood pub. They're so aptly named, these historical references, right? But it's a great place, great spot to get just a bite. As you go, you make your way on in through. And there's the Black Horse Inn. My favorite, I gotta stop in because it's so aptly named, the Dirty Habit Pub, which is a great play on words for those who may be making pilgrimage. And our priests are probably rolling their eyes as they're hearing this. But the Dirty Habit Pub is definitely one to stop in as you're going through all the way up through Canterbury. Reach the Canterbury Cathedral, the Shrine of St. Thomas Becket. And from here, pilgrims have some choices because my plan is to continue on and I'll walk to Dover and then onward towards Rome. As you said, it's one of those epic pilgrimages that I hope to complete, the Via Francigena. And there are options also for pilgrims who may just be taking transit to Canterbury. You can take the train from London directly to Canterbury, and then you can continue on. So there are pilgrimages that actually begin in Canterbury or connect Canterbury, and one of them is up through the northwest. And you want to talk a little bit about in your book, and I'm sorry, I know we're keeping you a little long. You want to talk about Canterbury to Ramsgate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is quite interesting because, as you say, if anyone's heard about pilgrimage in the UK, in England, they will know about the Pilgrim's Way from London to Canterbury. And it was a very famous pilgrimage until, so but there is an older pilgrimage. There's a pilgrimage that in the 600 years, is 600 years older than that tradition. And that is the pilgrimage for St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine is the man who, from Rome, re-Christianized southern England. We think Christianity was probably a minority faith during the Roman occupation, which has ended in the sort of the 5th century. But after that, England became pagan. So in the year 597, St. Augustine was sent from Rome to Christianize England, and he came to Kent, and he landed at Ramsgate. The first thing he had to do was convert the king, King Ethelbert, who was a pagan. If he did that, he'd be okay. Now, he had a card to play. Ethelbert's wife, Bertha, was French, and she was Christian. So he had a kind of in. So when you get to Ramsgate, you get a route where there is a place called St. Augustine's Cross, where he did his first sermon, and you go up through to Canterbury. Along the way, you get some amazing churches, and it's a wonderful route. You come to a place just outside Canterbury called Fordwich, where there is a Romanesque tomb. And the local story is that is St. Augustine's tomb. There's no proof to it, but it's a belief, and it's just in a little village church. And when you get to Canterbury, as you say, there's the cathedral, but there's two other things. Because when Augustine and his monks got to Canterbury, they first prayed in a church that Bertha prayed in, St. Martin's Church. That church is still there. You can still go to it. It's the oldest church continuously occupied church in the English-speaking world. It's remarkable. It's a fantastic place. And then you get between that and Canterbury Cathedral is St. Augustine's Abbey, which he built and where he was buried. We don't know what happened to his body, but it was completely destroyed by Henry. So Augustine's a kind of forgotten saint, because when you think about it, the Welsh have got St. David, the Scots have got St. Andrew. St. Augustine, until very recently, not really thought about. But then what happened was, if I take you back to Ramsgate to the start, there was a guy, a Victorian architect called Augustus Pugin, A-W-N Pugin, who was incredibly influential in the Catholic revival in this country and in rediscovering traditional Gothic architecture. And he built many hundreds of churches, not just Catholic, Anglican churches as well. But he built himself a house on the cliffs at Ramsgate, overlooking St. Augustine's Cross, and he named it after the saint. And only in 2012, it was decided that we needed a national shrine for St. Augustine because of his importance in our Christian tradition, and there wasn't one. So they established one, not at Canterbury, as you might think, but in Pugin's church at Ramsgate. So one of my walks is I go from Ramsgate and link up at Canterbury. But you could, if you're coming to Canterbury and you're thinking of going further on, you could always reverse things. Go on down to Ramsgate, and then you will be on the oldest, one of the oldest, pilgrimages. Way, as I say, 600 years older than the Becket pilgrimage. And once you're at Ramsgate, you can get a train along the coast to Dover and pick up your route again.
That's fantastic. We're talking with Andy Bull, author of Pilgrim Pathways from Trailblazer. We'll link the book in the show notes because clearly there are some exciting and historical routes that he has identified. He narrowed it down somehow to 20 in short walks, one day and weekend type walks that you can do throughout the UK to have your pilgrimage experience and really see some of these historical sites that have so influenced the English pilgrimage tradition and faith walks throughout the last 1,000 years. Andy, before we go, I just want to ask, you're quite an avid walker and obviously have had some time on your hands to get out and try to keep your sanity. Any trips planned, any walks that you haven't gotten to do that are on your bucket list, as it were, over the next few months or half year?
I walked 400 miles while I was doing the book over about a year, which was fantastic, and it made me fit and all the rest of it. But what I find now is anywhere I go, I start discovering things, because I think we've got 48 cathedrals. I've covered maybe 15 of them in my walks. There's a lot more cathedrals. All of them had pilgrim routes to them. So yeah, there's a number that I'm very, very interested in. There's one on the Isle of Wight, which is a small island off the south coast. And my family's traditionally from there, if you go back enough generations. And I went there just a few weeks ago, after when we had a brief respite from lockdown. And there's a wonderful abbey that's been restored there, and a lot of very interesting things. So I would love to go and explore that. And as I do find, for instance, I've got a London pilgrimage. If you go to a place, lots of people come to London, and there's lots of things to see in London. You might want the theatre, you might want, art galleries, royal palaces, but you can come as a pilgrim. Go to any of these places as a pilgrim, and it will be a new place to you.
There you go. This is the Sacred Steps podcast. Our guest is Andy Bull. His new book, Pilgrim Pathways, is available from Trailblazer Guides. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. It's been delightful to hear so much about these routes throughout England, Scotland, and Wales, and to begin to set new pathways on our bucket list.
Well, that is really kind of you. It's been great to be here. And I really do wish you well on your pilgrimage in the UK. And I know you've got others planned. And I think you're planning a book as well. So, Godspeed to you.
I appreciate it so much. Andy, Buen Camino, be well. I hope to be speaking with you again. In a moment, we'll talk about our next episode. But I am so grateful to have Andy Bull, author of Pilgrim Pathways, on the Sacred Steps podcast. Please be sure to check out the show notes where we'll link his book below. On our next episode, we're talking with Camino pilgrim Johnny Walker from Santiago, Spain. This year, Johnny took prayer requests from the community of global pilgrims and walked them across the Camino Frances. We'll share his emotional story on this Camino in the age of COVID on our next episode. So be sure to click subscribe so that podcast downloads directly to your device. I'm your host, Kevin Donahue, author of Sacred Steps, a Pilgrimage Journal. Until next time, be well, stay safe, and Buen Camino.